24 hours before I was supposed to marry Lyla Powell, she stood up at our rehearsal dinner and announced she was in love with my best man, Nelson Colton. In front of our families, our friends, and everyone who mattered to us, she chose him over me. But what she didn't expect was that her maid of honor, Margot Davies, would stand up immediately after and tell everyone that she'd been waiting 3 years for me to notice her. What happened next turned our wedding weekend into the most shocking 48 hours of my life. By Sunday evening, everything had changed. My bride, my future, and most surprisingly, my understanding of who had really been there for me all along. Some people say revenge is a dish best served cold, but sometimes the universe serves it up hot at exactly the right moment. This is the story of how one rehearsal dinner destroyed my life and rebuilt it in ways I never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of our rehearsal dinner, I woke up in my downtown Phoenix apartment, feeling like the luckiest man alive. In 18 hours, I would be marrying Lyla Powell, the woman I'd been dating for 3 years. The woman who'd stood by me through my transition from struggling photography assistant to owning my own wedding photography business. The woman who'd helped me pick out the perfect venue, the stunning Sedona Red Rock Resort, and who'd spent months planning every detail of what was supposed to be our perfect day. I should have known something was wrong when I found Lyla on the balcony at 6 a.m., still in her pajamas, staring out at the Phoenix skyline with her coffee growing cold in her hands. "Hey, beautiful," I said, wrapping my arms around her from behind. "Big day today, you ready for this?" She tensed in my arms, just slightly, but I noticed. After 3 years together, you learn to read these things, or at least you think you do. "Julian," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Can we talk after the rehearsal tonight? Just us?" "Of course," I replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," she said, but she didn't lean back into me the way she usually did. I want to make sure we're doing the right thing." I laughed, thinking she was having normal pre-wedding jitters. "Lyla, we've been together 3 years. We've lived together for 2. We've built a business together. If this isn't right, I don't know what is." She turned in my arms then, and I saw something in her green eyes that I couldn't quite place. Sadness? Guilt? Fear? "You're right," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm just nervous. It's a big step." "The biggest," I agreed, kissing her forehead. "But we're taking it together." If only I'd known then that she was already planning to take a very different step with someone else entirely. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of last-minute preparations. The wedding party was meeting at the resort at 4 p.m. for the ceremony. Rehearsal, followed by dinner at the elegant Copper Canyon restaurant. Lyla's parents had flown in from Chicago, mine from Portland. My older sister, Teresa, had arrived with her husband and kids. Everyone was excited, everyone was happy, everyone believed in us. Everyone except, apparently, my bride-to-be. Nelson Colton arrived at the resort, looking like he'd stepped off the cover of GQ magazine. My best friend since college, Nelson had always been the charmer, the one who could walk into any room and immediately become the center of attention. He was a successful real estate developer, drove a Tesla, and somehow always knew exactly what to say to make everyone feel like they were his best friend. When I'd asked him to be my best man, he'd hugged me and said, "Brother, I wouldn't miss this for the world. You and Lyla are perfect together." Looking back now, I wonder if that was when the plan started. "Julian." Nelson's voice boomed across the resort lobby as he strode toward me, arms extended for one of his signature bear hugs. "My man, how are you feeling? Ready to become a married man?" "Ready as I'll ever be," I said, returning his hug. "Thanks for being here, Nelson. It means everything." "Where else would I be?" he said, flashing that $1,000,000 smile. "Though I have to say, you're a lucky man. Lyla looks absolutely radiant today." I followed his gaze and saw Lyla emerging from the elevator with her maid of honor, Margot Davies. Even from across the lobby, Lyla was stunning in her flowing white sundress, her blonde hair catching the late afternoon light streaming through the resort's floor-to-ceiling windows. But it was Margot who caught my attention, and not for the first time. Margot had been Lyla's college roommate and closest friend for over 5 years. She was quieter than Lyla, more thoughtful, with dark auburn hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to notice everything. While Lyla commanded attention in any room, Margot had this way of making whoever she was talking to feel like they were the only person in the world. She was a graphic designer who worked mostly with small businesses, helping them create their brand identity. She'd actually designed the logo for my photography company, refusing to let me pay her for the work. She did an amazing job, Margot had said when I'd tried to insist on payment. Your work deserves beautiful branding. Besides, what are friends for? Friends. That's what we were. That's what I'd told myself we were, even though I'd caught myself looking forward to Margot's visits a little too much. Even though her laugh made me smile in a way that felt different from how I smiled at everyone else's jokes. Even though when she hugged me goodbye after dinner parties, I found myself holding on just a second longer than was probably appropriate. But Margot was Lila's best friend, and I was marrying Lyla. End of story. Except today, watching Margot walk across that lobby in her simple navy blue dress, her hair pulled back in an elegant twist. I felt that familiar flutter in my chest that I'd been pushing down for months. "Earth to Julian," Nelson said, nudging me with his elbow. "You're staring." "Just admiring my beautiful bride," I said quickly. But Nelson's knowing smirk told me he'd noticed exactly where my gaze had been focused. "Sure you were," he said with a chuckle. "Come on, let's go greet the ladies." As we walked across the lobby, I tried to shake off the weird energy I'd been feeling all day. Maybe it was just pre-wedding nerves. Maybe everyone felt this way the day before their wedding, like they were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into an unknown future. "Julian." Lila's voice was bright and cheerful as we approached, but there was something forced about it. She rose on her tiptoes to kiss me, but the kiss felt perfunctory, like she was performing for an audience. "Hi," Margot said softly, giving me a gentle hug. As always, she smelled like vanilla and something floral that I could never quite identify. "How are you holding up?" "Good," I said, realizing that I meant it more when I was talking to her than when I'd said it to anyone else all day. "How about you? Ready to give an embarrassing maid of honor speech tomorrow?" She laughed, and there it was again, that flutter. "Oh, I have some stories about you two that I'm definitely saving for tomorrow night." "Please be gentle," I said, grinning. "I have a reputation to maintain." "Your reputation is safe with me," she said, and something in the way she looked at me when she said it made my breath catch. "All right, lovebirds," Nelson interrupted, clapping his hands together. "Shouldn't we be heading to the chapel for rehearsal? Can't have the groom being late to his own practice run." As we walked toward the resort's wedding chapel, I found myself walking between Lyla and Margot, listening to them chat about last-minute details and tomorrow's timeline. Everything seemed normal, perfect even. The setting was gorgeous, the weather was ideal, our families were happy, our friends were excited. So why did I feel like I was walking toward the edge of a cliff, about to jump into something that would change everything in ways I couldn't even imagine? The rehearsal itself went smoothly, though I noticed that Lyla seemed distracted, missing her cues and needing the wedding coordinator to repeat instructions. Nelson, on the other hand, was on his A-game, charming everyone from the minister to Lila's grandmother. And Margot was exactly where she always was. Steady, supportive, paying attention to every detail to make sure everything went perfectly. "You've got this," she whispered to me as we lined up for our practice procession. "Just remember to breathe." And for some reason, when she said it, I actually believed her. If only I'd known that in just a few hours, I'd need all the breathing techniques I could get. The first red flag came during the actual rehearsal ceremony. We were practicing the processional when the wedding coordinator asked Lyla to demonstrate how she wanted to hold her bouquet. As she adjusted her stance, her phone buzzed. She immediately broke character, pulled out her phone, and smiled at whatever message she'd received. "Sorry," she said to the coordinator, typing a quick response. "Just a vendor confirming something for tomorrow." But I was standing right beside her. The message wasn't from a vendor. It was from Nelson. "You look beautiful up there. Can't wait to talk after dinner." My stomach dropped, but I told myself it was innocent. Nelson was always overly affectionate with his friends' girlfriends and wives. It didn't mean anything, right? Anything, right? The second red flag came 20 minutes later. We were practicing the recessional when Lyla stumbled slightly coming down the chapel steps. Nelson, who should have been focused on his own cue to follow us, immediately rushed forward to steady. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Careful there," he said, his hand lingering on her arm far longer than necessary. "Can't have the bride getting hurt before the big day." "My hero," Lyla said with a laugh that sounded different from her usual laugh. Lighter. More flirtatious? "That's what I'm here for," Nelson replied, and the way he looked at her made something cold settle in my chest. "Nelson," I said, trying to keep my voice light, "I think the wedding coordinator wants to run through the best man's responsibilities." "Of course," he said, finally releasing Lyla's arm. "Just looking out for your girl, brother. Your girl, not your fiancé. Not Lyla. Your girl." Like she was a possession that could be transferred. Margot, who had been watching the exchange from a few feet away, caught my eye and gave me a questioning look. I forced a smile and shrugged, but I could see the concern in her expression. The third red flag was during the photo session with our families. The photographer, a colleague of mine who I'd hired specifically because I knew his work was excellent, was trying to get candid shots of the wedding party mingling with family members. "Julian," he called out, "can you grab Lyla? I want to get some shots of you two with your parents." I looked around and spotted Lyla on the resort's outdoor terrace, but she wasn't alone. She was standing close to Nelson, closer than two people who were just friends typically stand. And they were deep in conversation. Her body language was completely different from how she'd been with me all day. She was animated, gesturing, with her hands, laughing at something he was saying. "Lyla," I called out, "we need you for photos." She looked over, and for just a split second, I saw something that looked almost like guilt flash across her face before she composed herself. "Coming," she called back, but not before she touched Nelson's arm and said something that made him nod seriously. When she reached me, I couldn't help but ask, "What were you two talking about?" "Oh, just groomsmen stuff," she said vaguely. He had some questions about tomorrow's timeline, but Nelson had been at the rehearsal. He'd heard the same timeline explanation from the wedding coordinator that everyone else had heard. What questions could he possibly have? The fourth red flag came during the cocktail hour before dinner. The resort had set up a beautiful outdoor area with string lights and a jazz trio, and everyone was mingling with drinks and appetizers. I was talking with Lyla's father about his golf game when I realized I hadn't seen Lyla in a while. I found her again with Nelson, this time sitting together on a secluded bench near the resort's meditation garden. They weren't just talking now. Nelson had his arm around her shoulders, and Lyla was leaning into him in a way that made my blood pressure spike. "Having a private moment?" I asked, approaching them with what I hoped was a casual tone. They sprang apart like teenagers caught making out behind the school. "Julian," Lyla said, her voice too bright. Nelson was telling me about this amazing honeymoon destination he visited last year. He thought we might want to consider it for our next anniversary trip." "How thoughtful," I said, looking directly at Nelson. "Though I thought we'd already planned our honeymoon." "Of course we have," Lyla said quickly. "This was just for future reference." Nelson stood up, straightening his jacket. "I should probably go check on the other groomsmen," he said. "Make sure they're not getting too drunk before dinner." As he walked away, I sat down next to Lyla on the bench. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "You seem distant today." "I'm fine," she said, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. "Just overwhelmed. It's a lot, you know? All these people, all this attention." "Hey," I said, taking her hand. "Look at me." When she finally did, I saw something in her eyes that made my chest tighten. It wasn't pre-wedding nerves. It was something deeper, more troubling. "Lyla, if you're having second thoughts, I'm not," she said quickly. Too quickly. "I'm just tired. It's been a long day." But as we sat there in silence, I noticed her gaze drifting across the party until it found Nelson again. And when it did, her entire demeanor changed. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing deepened, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. That's when Margot appeared beside us. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but they're asking everyone to head into the restaurant for dinner." "Of course," I said, standing and offering Lyla my hand. "Ready for this, beautiful?" Lyla took my hand and smiled, but it felt mechanical, like she was going through the motions. As we walked toward the restaurant, Margot fell into step beside me while Lyla walked slightly ahead, already scanning the crowd for someone. 3 guesses who? "Julian," Margot said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Sure. Are you okay? You seem tense." I looked at her, really looked at her. Margot had always been perceptive, always able to read people in a way that others couldn't. It was one of the things I'd always admired about her. "I'm fine," I said, but even I could hear how unconvincing it sounded. "No, you're not," she said gently. "And honestly, I'm worried about you." "Worried about me? Why?" She hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Because I've been watching Julian, and I see things. I notice things. And what I'm seeing tonight..." "What are you seeing?" She stopped walking and turned to face me. In the soft glow of the string lights, her brown eyes looked almost golden. "I'm seeing a man who deserves so much better than what he's getting," she said quietly. "And I'm seeing someone who's about to get hurt in a very public way." Before I could ask her what she meant, Lyla's voice called out from ahead of us. "Julian! Margot! Come on! They're seating us now!" As we hurried to catch up, Margot's words echoed in my mind. Someone who's about to get hurt in a very public way. Looking back now, I realized that Margot had already figured out what was coming. She'd been watching, paying attention, seeing the patterns that I'd been too blind or too trusting to notice. The patterns that were about to destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. The patterns that were about to make the next few hours the most humiliating and life-changing of my existence. But also, though I didn't know it yet, the patterns that were about to lead me to something better than I ever could have imagined. The Copper Canyon restaurant at Sedona Red Rock Resort was everything we dreamed of for our rehearsal dinner. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the dramatic red rock formations glowing in the setting sun, while elegant chandeliers cast warm light over the mahogany tables. The restaurant had given us their private dining room, complete with a fireplace and a separate bar area where guests could mingle before taking their seats. I should have been focused on the stunning setting, on our families meeting and bonding, on the excitement building toward tomorrow's ceremony. Instead, I found myself constantly scanning the room, tracking Lyla's movements, noting every interaction between her and Nelson. During cocktails, I tried to stay close to her, but she kept drifting away. First to talk to my sister Teresa about the music playlist for tomorrow's reception. Then to discuss seating arrangements with her mother. Each time I'd follow, only to find that somehow Nelson had appeared in the conversation too, always positioning himself just a little too close to Lyla, always finding reasons to touch her arm or shoulder while making a point. "Julian, you need to see this," my father said, approaching me with his phone out. "Your mother found this old photo from your college graduation. Look how young you all look." I tried to focus on the photo, tried to laugh at the appropriate moments as Dad scrolled through old pictures. But my attention kept drifting. Where was Lyla now? I scanned the room and didn't see her anywhere. "Dad, excuse me for just a second," I said. "I need to find Lyla. I think they're about to start dinner." "Of course, son. Go find your bride." But finding her wasn't as easy as it should have been. She wasn't at the bar, wasn't in the main dining area where most of the guests were gathered, wasn't in the ladies' room according to Margot, who I'd quickly asked. "She said she needed some air," Margot told me, her expression carefully neutral. "I think she went out to the terrace." The terrace. Of course. The restaurant's terrace was accessible through French doors from the bar area. It offered an even more spectacular view of the red rocks, especially at sunset, and had become a popular spot for guests to take photos throughout the evening. As I approached the doors, I could hear voices coming from outside, low, intimate conversation that made me slow my approach. Through the glass doors, I could see 2 figures silhouetted against the sunset. They were standing at the far end of the terrace, partially hidden behind a decorative stone column that supported an overhead pergola. The positioning was deliberate, chosen for privacy. I pushed open one of the French doors as quietly as possible and stepped onto the terrace. The voices became clearer now, and my blood turned to ice as I recognized them. "Can't keep doing this," Lyla was saying, her voice strained with emotion. "It's not fair to him. It's not fair to anyone. Not fair to anyone." "I know," Nelson replied, his voice gentler than I'd ever heard it. "But I can't help how I feel. I've tried to stay away, Lyla. God knows I've tried." I crept closer, staying in the shadows near the door, my heart hammering so hard I was sure they'd hear it. "When did this happen?" Lyla asked. "When did everything get so complicated?" "For me, the night we all went to that wine tasting 3 months ago, remember? Julian had to leave early for that client emergency, and we ended up closing down the bar, just talking until 2 a.m. 3 months ago. 3 months they'd been, what? Having an emotional affair? Planning this?" "I remember," Lyla said softly. "You told me about your divorce, about how lonely you'd been. And I told you about how you weren't sure you were ready for marriage. About how you felt like you were going through the motions with Julian because it was expected, not because it felt right." My chest felt like someone had reached inside and squeezed my heart with a fist. Going through the motions? Because it was expected? That's not... I care about Julian. I do. He's a good man. "He is a good man," Nelson agreed. "Which makes this so much harder. But Lyla, good isn't enough. Not when what we have is what?" I found myself leaning forward, straining to hear Nelson's answer, even though every word was like a knife twisting in my gut. "Electric," he said finally. "Real. Undeniable." And then I saw it. The moment that changed everything. Nelson reached up and cupped Lyla's face in his hands. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, closing her eyes like she was savoring it. They stood like that for what felt like an eternity, foreheads almost touching, breathing the same air. "Nelson," she whispered, and there was so much longing in that single word that I felt something inside me break. "I know," he said. "Tomorrow you're marrying Julian, and then what? We pretend this never happened? We pretend we don't feel this?" "I don't know," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I honestly don't know." That's when Nelson kissed her forehead, a gesture so tender and intimate that it hurt more than if I'd caught them making out passionately. This wasn't just physical attraction. This was emotional connection. This was love. And I was standing 10 feet away, watching my fiancé fall apart in another man's arms less than 18 hours before our wedding. "We should go back inside," Lyla said finally, but she made no move to step away from him. "In a minute," Nelson said. "Let me just hold you for one more minute. After tomorrow." "Don't," she said. "Don't talk about after tomorrow. I can't think about that right now." "Okay," he said, pulling her closer. "No talking, just this." I watched them embrace, watched Lyla melt into Nelson's arms like she belonged there, watched her find comfort with him that she'd never seemed to find with me, the way she fit against him, the way she relaxed completely in his arms, the way she seemed to become more herself rather than less. It was everything our relationship had never been. And in that moment, standing in the shadows watching the woman I was supposed to marry find her home in another man's arms, I realized that Margot had been right. Someone was about to get hurt in a very public way. Me. But more than that, I realized something else that hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't even angry about the betrayal itself. I was angry about the timing, about the public humiliation I was about to face, about the wedding that would have to be canceled and the money that would be lost and the explanations that would have to be given. But I wasn't heartbroken about losing Lyla. And that realization scared me more than anything else I'd discovered on that terrace. As I quietly backed away from the scene, returning to the warmth and light of the restaurant, I caught sight of myself in the reflection of the glass doors. I looked like a ghost, pale, hollow-eyed, lost. "Julian?" Margot's voice came from behind me. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen..." She trailed off as she followed my gaze to the terrace, where Lyla and Nelson were still wrapped in their embrace. "Oh," she said quietly. "Oh, Julian, I'm so sorry." And the thing that broke my heart wasn't what I'd just witnessed on the terrace. It was the genuine pain in Margot's voice as she said my name. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at my reflection in the glass doors, processing what I'd just witnessed. Margot remained beside me, not saying anything, just being present in that way she always was when someone needed support. "How long have you known?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Known what, exactly?" She replied carefully. "Don't do that. Don't pretend. You warned me earlier that I was about to get hurt in a public way. You've been watching them all evening. How long have you suspected?" Margot sighed, running her hands through her hair and messing up her carefully styled updo. "About 6 weeks," she admitted. Lyla started acting differently, secretive, happy in a way that seemed separate from you. And then Nelson started showing up to things he'd never cared about before. Girls' night dinners, art gallery openings, shopping trips where he'd just happened to be at the same mall. 6 weeks. I felt sick. "And you didn't think to tell me, Julian?" she said, turning to face me fully. "What was I supposed to say? Hey, I think your fiancé might be developing feelings for your best man based on a gut feeling? You would have thought I was crazy, or jealous, or trying to sabotage your relationship." She was right, and we both knew it. If she'd come to me with suspicions, I would have defended Lyla, made excuses, convinced myself that Margot was imagining things. "Besides," she continued, "I kept hoping I was wrong. I kept hoping that whatever was happening would burn itself out before this weekend." Through the glass doors, I could see that Lyla and Nelson had finally separated and were making their way back toward the restaurant. Lyla was smoothing down her hair and adjusting her dress, while Nelson was checking his reflection in his phone camera. They looked like teenagers sneaking back into the house after curfew. "I need to talk to her," I said. "Julian, maybe you should wait until—" "No," I said firmly. "I need to do this now, before dinner, before we sit through 2 hours of toasts and speeches celebrating a marriage that's apparently a lie." Margot nodded reluctantly. "Do you want me to create a distraction? Get Nelson away from her?" "No. Let him watch. Let him see what happens when someone actually confronts their lies." As Lyla and Nelson entered the restaurant through the French doors, I intercepted them. "Lyla," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Can I talk to you? Privately?" She looked startled, her eyes darting to Nelson before coming back to me. "Of course, is everything okay?" "That's what I'd like to find out." Nelson, to his credit, at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I'll just go check on the bar situation," he said, practically fleeing toward the other side of the restaurant. I led Lyla to a quiet corner near the fireplace, away from the main crowd but still visible to anyone who might look our way. I wanted privacy for this conversation, but I also wanted witnesses. Something told me I was going to need them. "Julian, you're scaring me," Lyla said, settling into one of the leather armchairs. "What's wrong?" "I saw you," I said simply, taking the chair across from her. "On the terrace. With Nelson." The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. "You saw? What did you see?" "I saw enough. I heard enough." I leaned forward, studying her face. 3 months, Lyla. This has been going on. For 3 months? Her hands started shaking, and she clasped them together in her lap. "Julian, it's not what you think. It's not what I think." I couldn't keep the incredulity out of my voice. "What I think is that my fiancé has been having an emotional affair with my best man for a quarter of our engagement. What I think is that the woman I'm supposed to marry tomorrow told another man that she's only going through the motions with me because it's expected. Please, enlighten me about what part of that I'm misunderstanding." Tears started rolling down her cheeks, but instead of feeling sympathy, I felt a cold detachment that surprised me. "You weren't supposed to find out like this," she whispered. "I wasn't supposed to find out at all, was I? What was the plan, Lyla? Marry me tomorrow and continue sneaking around with Nelson? Or were you planning to call off the wedding at some point?" "I don't know," she said, her voice rising enough that a few nearby guests glanced our way. She immediately lowered it again. "I honestly don't know what I was planning. I've been so confused, so torn." "Torn between what?" "Between what I should do and what I want to do," she said, as if that explanation made perfect sense. And what do you want to do? She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her engagement ring. I want to be with Nelson, she said finally. I want to be with someone who makes me feel alive, who challenges me, who makes me want to be a better person. The words hit like physical blows, but what hurt more was the implication behind them. And I don't do those things for you. Julian, you're safe, she said, as if that was supposed to be a compliment. You're stable and reliable, and you'll be a good provider. You're everything a woman should want in a husband. Should want, but not what you want. I thought it would be enough, she said desperately. I thought I could grow to feel that kind of passion for you. I thought that maybe the butterflies and excitement were just immature fantasies, and that what we had was real, adult love. And now? Now I know the difference, she said quietly. And I can't unknow it. I sat back in my chair, feeling like I was seeing Lyla clearly for the first time in 3 years. So why didn't you just break up with me? Why go through with the engagement, the wedding planning, all of it? Because I do care about you, she said, reaching for my hands. I pulled them away. Because our families love each other. Because it makes sense on paper. Because I thought maybe the feelings for Nelson would fade if I ignored them long enough. But they didn't fade. They got stronger. And you decided to act on them. We didn't plan for it to happen, she said defensively. That night 3 months ago, when you had to leave the wine tasting early, we were just talking. He was going through his divorce, I was stressed about wedding planning, and we just connected. It was supposed to be one conversation, one moment of understanding between friends. But it wasn't. No, she admitted. It wasn't. We started texting, then meeting for coffee, then she trailed off, then falling in love. She nodded, fresh tears spilling over. I'm so sorry, Julian. I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did want to be with Nelson more than you wanted to avoid hurting me. The silence that followed was answer enough. I stood up, smoothing down my jacket. Around us, the rehearsal dinner was in full swing. Our families were laughing and sharing stories. Our friends were toasting our future happiness, and the woman I was supposed to marry in 18 hours had just confirmed that she was in love with someone else. So what happens now? I asked. I don't know, she said again, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. What do you want to happen? And that's when I realized the most shocking thing of all. I didn't want to fight for her. I didn't want to beg her to choose me. Didn't want to compete with Nelson for her affections. Didn't want to convince her that what we had was worth saving. I just wanted this conversation to be over. I want you to be happy, Lyla, I said, and I meant it. I want you to be with someone who makes you feel alive and challenged and all those things you said Nelson makes you feel, but I also want you to be honest about it. Our families and friends are in there celebrating our wedding. They deserve to know the truth. You want me to tell everyone? Tonight? I want you to stop lying, I said simply. To them, to me, and to yourself. As I walked away from her, heading back toward the main dining room where dinner was about to be served, I caught sight of Margot watching me from across the room. When our eyes met, she gave me the smallest, most supportive smile, and I felt something I hadn't felt all day. I felt like someone was actually on my side. The dining room had been transformed into something from a magazine spread while we'd been having our devastating conversation. The tables were set with crisp white linens, elegant place settings, and centerpieces of white roses and desert wildflowers that perfectly complemented the stunning red rock views through the windows. Soft jazz music played from hidden speakers, and the warm glow of candles created an atmosphere of romance and celebration. It was perfect, absolutely perfect, and it was all a lie. Ladies and gentlemen, the restaurant manager announced, "Dinner is served. Please find your assigned seats." I looked around the room at the 60 people who had traveled from across the country to celebrate Lyla and me. My parents, beaming with pride as they found their table near the front. Lyla's grandmother, who had insisted on making the trip despite her arthritis because she wouldn't miss her darling's special weekend for anything in the world. My sister Teresa and her family, my college friends, Lyla's sorority sisters, cousins, and aunts and uncles who had booked hotel rooms and taken time off work to be here. They were all here because they believed in us, because they thought we were happy, in love, building a life together, because they had no idea that the bride-to-be had just confessed to being in love with someone else. The head table was positioned to face the room, so everyone could see us during the speeches. Lyla and I were seated in the center, with Nelson to my right and Margot to Lyla's left. The positioning felt like cosmic mockery. The four people who knew the truth about this weekend's drama, forced to sit together and perform happiness for everyone else. As I approached my seat, Nelson stood and extended his hand to me. "Julian," he said with that same confident smile he'd worn all day. "Ready for the big night?" I looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment before shaking it. "Absolutely," I said, meeting his eyes. "I think tonight's going to be full of surprises." Something flickered in his expression. Uncertainty, maybe even fear, before he recovered his composure. Lyla took her seat beside me, and I could feel the tension radiating from her body. She kept fidgeting with her napkin, adjusting her silverware, checking her phone. When the servers began bringing out the first course, she barely touched her food. "Julian," she whispered, leaning close to me. "We need to talk about what we're going to do." "What we're going to do?" I kept my voice low but couldn't hide my incredulity. "We? There is no we anymore, Lyla. You made that abundantly clear. But everyone's here. The families, the wedding tomorrow? The wedding that you don't want to go through with because you're in love with someone else?" She glanced around nervously, making sure no one was listening. "Keep your voice down." "Why? Worried people might overhear the truth?" From across the table, Margot caught my eye and gave me a questioning look. I could see the concern written all over her face, and I realized that watching me suffer through this dinner was almost as painful for her as it was for me. "Everything okay over there?" my father called from his table, raising his wine glass. "You two look awfully serious for a couple about to tie the knot." "Just discussing tomorrow's timeline," I called back, forcing a smile. "Making sure everything goes smoothly." If only he knew how far from smooth things were about to get. The first speech came during the salad course. Lyla's father stood up, tapping his wine glass with his knife to get everyone's attention. "I'd like to say a few words about my daughter, and Julian," he began, his voice warm with paternal pride. "When Lyla first told us she was dating a photographer, her mother and I wondered if he'd be able to provide the stability she deserved. But watching these two together over the past 3 years, seeing how Julian supports Lyla's dreams, how he makes her laugh, how he looks at her like she hung the moon." I glanced at Lyla during her father's speech. She was staring down at her plate, tears threatening to spill over. This man who clearly adored his daughter was praising me for qualities that, apparently, weren't enough to make her want to marry me. And I know that tomorrow, when I walk Lyla down that aisle, I'll be giving her to a man who will love and cherish her for the rest of her life. "To Julian and Lyla, to Julian and Lyla," the room chorused, 60 glasses raised in celebration of a relationship that had died on a terrace 20 minutes ago. My mother was next, sharing stories about how happy I'd seemed since meeting Lyla, how she'd never seen me so settled and content. Then came Lyla's college roommate, talking about how Lyla had called her after our first date, gushing about this amazing guy who actually listens when I talk. With each speech, each toast, each heartfelt sentiment about our perfect love story, I felt the weight of deception growing heavier. These people genuinely cared about us. They'd invested time, money, and emotional energy in celebrating our relationship. And it was all based on a fiction that Lyla and Nelson had been carefully constructing for months. Halfway through dinner, Nelson stood up. "I know it's traditional for the best man to save his speech for the wedding reception," he said. That charming smile in full effect. But I couldn't wait another day to say this. A hush fell over the room. I felt Lyla tense beside me. "Julian and I have been friends since college," Nelson continued, his eyes finding mine across the table. "I've watched him date, I've met his girlfriends, and I've never seen him as happy as he's been with Lyla." The irony was suffocating. "But more than that," Nelson went on, his gaze shifting to Lyla. "I've watched Lyla blossom into the woman she was meant to be. She's more confident, more radiant, more herself than I've ever seen her. Was he doing this on purpose? Was this some kind of twisted game where he praised our relationship while secretly planning to destroy it? Some people spend their whole lives looking for their soulmate. Nelson said, his voice growing more emotional. Julian and Lyla found each other when they were young enough to grow together, to build something real and lasting. Tomorrow, we're not just celebrating a wedding, we're celebrating true love. The applause was thunderous. People were dabbing their eyes with napkins, overcome by the beauty of Nelson's words. And I was sitting there, listening to the man who was destroying my engagement give a speech about soulmates and true love. It was then that I noticed something that made my blood run cold. While Nelson was speaking, while everyone else was focused on him, Lyla wasn't looking at me or at Nelson. She was looking at Margot with an expression I'd never seen before. Jealousy? Fear? Something that looked almost like panic? And Margot was looking right back, her brown eyes steady and unblinking, like she was having a silent conversation with my fiancé that I couldn't understand. What did Margot know that I didn't? What was passing between them in that moment? As Nelson finished his speech and sat down to more applause, I realized that tonight was going to be even more complicated than I'd thought. There were more secrets at this table than just Lyla's affair with Nelson. There were secrets that involved Margot. And something told me that when the truth finally came out, and I could feel it building like a storm on the horizon, it was going to change everything in ways I couldn't even imagine. "Julian," Lyla whispered urgently beside me, her voice barely audible. "I need to tell you something before—" But she was interrupted by the sound of someone else tapping a wine glass. Someone who was about to change the course of the entire evening. Margot was standing up, her own glass raised, looking directly at me. "I'd like to say something too," she said, her voice clear and strong. "If that's okay." And in that moment, I knew that the crisis I'd been dreading was about to begin. "Actually," Lyla said suddenly, her voice cutting through the room as she stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Actually, I need to say something first." Margot paused, her wine glass still raised, her eyes fixed on Lyla with an expression I couldn't read. Around the room, 60 faces turned toward us with expectant smiles, waiting for what they assumed would be another heartfelt speech about love and commitment. If only they knew. "Lyla," I said quietly, reaching for her hand. "Maybe we should—" "No," she said, pulling away from me. "No more waiting, no more pretending." Her voice was shaking, but there was a determination in it that I'd never heard before. "Everyone needs to know the truth." My mother leaned forward at her table, her smile faltering slightly. "Lyla, dear, are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling—" Lyla took a shaky breath, looking around the room at all the faces watching her. "I'm feeling like I need to be honest for the first time in months." The room went completely silent. Even the jazz music seemed to fade into the background as everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen. 3 months ago, Lyla began, her voice growing stronger. "I realized something that I should have realized a long time ago. Julian is a wonderful man. He's kind, he's stable. He's everything any woman should want in a husband." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. My father nodded approvingly. "But should want isn't the same as do want," Lyla continued, and I watched as confusion began to replace the smiles on our guests' faces. "And I've been lying to myself, to Julian, and to all of you about what I really want." "Lyla," Nelson said, suddenly, his voice sharp with warning. "Maybe this isn't the time." "When is the time, Nelson?" she snapped, turning to face him. "After the wedding? After we spend the rest of our lives pretending?" And that's when I saw it happen. That's when I watched 60 people simultaneously realize that this wasn't going to be a heartfelt toast. "What I want," Lyla said, her voice now carrying clearly through the deadly silent room. "What I've wanted for 3 months is to be honest about the fact that I'm in love with someone else." The silence that followed was deafening. It was like the entire room had collectively stopped breathing. "I'm in love with Nelson," she said, the words dropping like bombs in the elegant dining room. "I have been for months, and I can't marry Julian tomorrow knowing that my heart belongs to someone else." The explosion of shocked gasps, dropped silverware, and stunned exclamations was immediate and overwhelming. Someone's wine glass hit the floor and shattered. A woman at one of the back tables audibly gasped, "Oh my God!" My sister Teresa half stood from her chair, her mouth hanging open. But all I could focus on was my mother's face, the complete devastation written across her features as she watched her son's life implode in front of 60 witnesses. Lyla. Lyla's mother stood up so quickly she knocked over her chair. "What are you saying? What are you doing?" "I'm being honest, Mom," Lyla said, tears streaming down her face now. "I'm finally being honest." My father's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and angry. "Nelson, is this true?" All eyes turned to Nelson, who had gone pale as a sheet. For the first time since I'd known him, the man who always had the right words looked completely speechless. He started, then stopped. He looked at Lyla, then at me, then back at the room full of people waiting for an answer. "I never meant for this to happen. That's not what I asked," my father said, his voice dangerously low. "I asked if it's true." Nelson's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's true." The room erupted again, louder this time. Angry voices, shocked exclamations, the sound of chairs scraping as people stood up. Someone was crying. Multiple someones, actually. The careful elegance of the evening had devolved into complete chaos in the span of 30 seconds. Through it all, I sat there frozen, watching my life disintegrate in real time. This morning, I'd been a man about to marry the woman he loved. Now I was a man who'd been publicly humiliated in front of everyone who mattered to him, discovering that his 3-year relationship had been a lie. But then, through the noise and confusion, I heard Margot's voice, clear and strong. "Well," she said, and something in her tone made the entire room quiet down again. "Since we're being honest," she was still standing, still holding her wine glass, looking directly at me with an expression that was part determination, part terror, and part something else I couldn't identify. "Since we're telling the truth," she continued, "I think everyone should know that I've been in love with Julian for 3 years. If the room had been silent before, it was tomb-like now. You could have heard a pin drop on the red rock formations outside." "What?" Lyla whispered, sinking back into her chair. 3 years, Margot repeated, never taking her eyes off me. Since the first time Lyla brought him to meet me. Since the moment he shook my hand and asked me about the book I was reading. Since he remembered 2 weeks later to ask me how it ended. I stared at her, my mind reeling. 3 years? She'd been... "I've watched him love you, Lyla," Margot continued, her voice steady despite the tears now flowing down her cheeks. "I've watched him plan this wedding, watched him light up every time your name was mentioned, watched him be the kind of man who deserves to be loved completely and honestly." "Margot," I started, but she held up her hand. "I'm not finished," she said. "I've spent 3 years being the perfect best friend, supporting your relationship, helping plan your wedding, pretending that it didn't break my heart a little bit every time I saw you two together. But if we're being honest about what we really want," she finally looked away from me, scanning the room full of shocked faces. "What I want is for Julian to know that there's someone who has loved him exactly as he is from the very beginning. Someone who thinks he's not just stable and safe, but passionate and brilliant and worthy of being someone's first choice, not their consolation prize." The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. "So there," Margot said, finally sitting down and setting her wine glass on the table with a soft clink. "Since we're having an honesty party." For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The 4 of us at the head table sat there like we were frozen in some terrible tableau, while 60 people stared at us in complete shock. Then Lyla's grandmother, all 92 years of her, stood up slowly and declared in her wavering but determined voice, "Well, this is better than my stories." And somehow, impossibly, that broke the spell. A few people laughed nervously. Others started talking in hushed, urgent whispers. The servers, who had been standing frozen with dinner plates, began moving again. But I couldn't move. I couldn't process what had just happened. In the span of 5 minutes, I'd gone from being the groom-to-be in a fairy tale wedding to being the center of the most dramatic scene anyone in that room would probably ever witness. My wedding was destroyed. My relationship was over. My best friend had betrayed me in the most public way possible, and the woman I'd been secretly attracted to for 3 years had just declared her love for me in front of God and everyone. I looked around the table at the 3 people who had just blown up my entire life and realized that I had absolutely no idea what happened next. The aftermath of Margot's declaration felt like being underwater. Sounds were muffled and distorted, the whispered conversations, the scraping of chairs, the awkward coughs and nervous laughter. I could see people's mouths moving, but I couldn't process what they were saying because my entire world had just shifted on its axis. Margot loved me. Had loved me for 3 years. While I'd been building a relationship with Lyla, thinking I was happy, thinking I was in love, Margot had been there, watching, waiting, loving me silently while I planned a wedding. To her best friend, Julian, Margot's voice cut through my mental fog. She was looking at me with those intelligent brown eyes, and for the first time I could see everything she'd been hiding. The careful way she'd always looked at me, the slight sadness that would cross her face when Lyla and I were affectionate in front of her, the way she'd always been the first to defend me when Lyla complained about my work schedule or my photography equipment taking up space in our apartment. "You've been in love with me for 3 years?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," she said simply. "I know this is terrible timing, and I know this is probably the last thing you need to deal with right now." But when Lyla started talking about honesty, I realized I was tired of pretending too. Around us, the room was slowly returning to some semblance of order. The initial shock was wearing off, and people were beginning to whisper among themselves, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. But I couldn't focus on them. I could only focus on Margot and the way everything I thought I knew about the past 3 years was rearranging itself in my mind. "The book," I said suddenly, the memory surfacing with startling clarity. "The first time we met, you were reading The Time Traveler's Wife." She smiled, and it was different from any smile I'd ever seen from her before. Softer, more vulnerable. "You remember. You said it was about loving someone across time, even when circumstances keep pulling you apart. And 2 weeks later, when I asked you how it ended, you were the first person who'd ever remembered to follow up on something." "I'd mentioned in passing," she said. Lyla had already forgotten by the time we got back to her dorm room. I stared at her, pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed clicking into place. "All those times you helped with my business. The logo design, the website copy, staying up until 2 a.m. helping me edit photos for client presentations. I wanted to support your dreams," she said. "I wanted to be part of building something you cared about. And Lyla thought your photography was a nice hobby until you could get a real job," Margot said gently. She told me that at least 3 times. The contrast hit me like a physical blow. While my fiancé had been tolerating my career, viewing it as something I'd eventually outgrow, Margot had been actively helping me build it. While Lyla had been falling in love with my best friend, Margot had been falling in love with me. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I asked. "Because you were happy with Lyla. Or I thought you were. And she's my best friend, was my best friend, and I couldn't what? Couldn't destroy her happiness for my own selfish feelings." But as she said it, I realized something that should have terrified me but instead felt like relief. I hadn't been happy with Lyla. Not really. I'd been comfortable, settled, going through the motions just like she'd said. The passion, the excitement, the feeling of being truly known and appreciated. I'd never had that with Lyla. But sitting here, looking at Margot, remembering all the moments over the past 3 years when talking to her had felt effortless, when her laugh had made me smile for no reason I could explain, when her opinion had mattered more to me than anyone else's. "Julian," Lyla's voice interrupted my thoughts. She was leaning toward me, her face streaked with tears and mascara. "I'm so sorry. I know this is all wrong. I know the timing is terrible, but Nelson and we can't help how we feel." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing. No anger, no heartbreak, no desperate desire to fight for our relationship. Just nothing. "You're right," I said, and her face crumpled with what looked like relief. "I am? You can't help how you feel," I agreed. "And neither can I." I stood up, my legs slightly unsteady, and walked around the table to where Margot was sitting. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as I extended my hand to her. 3 years is a long time to wait for someone to notice you," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm sorry it took a public disaster for me to realize what was right in front of me. Margot looked up at me, her eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. Julian, what are you saying? I'm saying that maybe this isn't a disaster, I said, taking her hand and helping her to her feet. Maybe this is the best thing that could have happened. The room was dead silent again, but this time it felt different, less shocked, more expectant. Margot Davies, I said, looking into her eyes and seeing my future there instead of my past. Would you like to get out of here with me? What about the wedding? Someone called out from the back of the room. What about tomorrow? I looked around at all the faces watching us. My parents, Lyla's family, our friends and relatives who had traveled so far to celebrate what they thought was my happily ever after. There isn't going to be a wedding tomorrow, I said clearly, at least not the one we planned. I turned back to Margot, who was staring at me like she couldn't quite believe what was happening. But if you're interested, I continued, maybe we could start planning a different kind of future. One that's based on honesty instead of settling, on passion instead of convenience, on someone actually choosing me instead of just accepting me as a consolation prize. The smile that spread across Margot's face was like watching the sun rise. I've been choosing you for 3 years, Julian Turner, she said. I'd love to finally get to do it out loud. As we walked hand in hand toward the restaurant's exit, leaving behind the chaos of broken engagements and shattered expectations, I heard my grandmother's voice call out behind us. Now that's what I call a plot twist. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I started laughing. Real, genuine, from the bottom of my soul laughter. Because she was right. This was the best plot twist of my life. The woman I was supposed to marry had chosen someone else, destroying our wedding and humiliating me in front of everyone I cared about. But the woman who had been quietly loving me all along had just chosen to save me from the biggest mistake of my life. And as we stepped out into the cool Sedona night, with the red rocks standing like silent sentinels under a canopy of stars, I realized that sometimes the best things come from the worst disasters. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find everything you actually needed. We drove in comfortable silence through the winding roads of Sedona, the red rocks glowing silver in the moonlight. I'd borrowed my sister's rental car, needing to escape the chaos of the resort and the inevitable conversations that would follow our dramatic exit. Margot sat beside me, occasionally giving directions to a place she said would be perfect for thinking. Turn left here, she said softly, pointing to a small road that led up into the hills. There's a lookout point about a mile up that has the best view of the valley. As we climbed higher, I found myself stealing glances at her profile in the dashboard light. Without the tension and pretense of the rehearsal dinner, she looked different. More relaxed, more herself. Her hair had come loose from its careful updo, and she'd kicked off her heels, curling her feet under her in the passenger seat. How long have you known about this place? I asked. I found it 2 years ago when I came to visit Lyla for her birthday weekend, remember? She wanted to do that spiritual retreat thing at the healing center. I did remember. Lyla had been going through what she called her finding herself phase, trying everything from meditation to crystal healing to past life regression. I'd stayed home that weekend, claiming I had too much work to do. But honestly, I'd been relieved to have some time alone. You came up here by yourself? I needed some space, Margot said with a small smile. Lyla was a lot that weekend. Very intense about discovering her authentic self and finding her true purpose. I love her. But sometimes, I just needed quiet. The road ended at a small parking area carved into the hillside. Below us, the lights of Sedona twinkled like fallen stars. And beyond that, the vast darkness of the Arizona desert stretched to the horizon. This is incredible, I said, getting out of the car and walking to the stone barrier at the edge of the lookout. Margot joined me, wrapping her arms around herself in the cool night air. Without thinking, I shrugged out of my jacket and draped it around her shoulders. Thank you, she said. And something about the way she said it made me think she wasn't just talking about the jacket. We stood there for a while, looking out at the view, both of us probably processing the surreal events of the evening. Can I ask you something? I said finally. Anything? When did you know? When did you realize you had feelings for me? She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Then she turned to face me, leaning back against the stone barrier. "Do you remember the night about 6 months after you and Lyla started dating? You'd gotten that commission to photograph the Anderson family reunion, your first big-paying job?" I nodded. It had been a breakthrough moment for my business, proof that I could actually make a living as a photographer. Lyla was supposed to come to the celebration dinner your parents threw, but she canceled at the last minute, some work thing, and I came instead, as Lyla's representative. I remembered that night. My parents had been so excited about my success, and I'd been nervous about celebrating without Lyla there to share it with me. "You spent the entire evening asking me about the technical aspects of the shoot," Margot continued. "The lighting challenges, how I managed to get such natural expressions. From the teenagers, what equipment I'd used. You were so passionate when you talked about it. So animated and excited, I remember. You actually understood what I was talking about, which was unusual. Most people's eyes glaze over when I start talking about aperture settings and composition." "That's when I knew," she said quietly. "Not just that I was attracted to you, but that I was falling in love with you. Because you lit up when you talked about your work, and I could see this incredible creative mind that most people never got to witness. Lyla included." Her words hit me with unexpected force. She never asked about my work. I mean, she'd ask how my day went, but she never wanted details. Never wanted details. I know. And it frustrated me so much, watching her take for granted this amazing person who had so much passion and talent and creativity to offer. I stared at her, trying to process the fact that for 2.5 years, someone had been seeing qualities in me that my own fiancé had overlooked. "What else?" I asked. "What do you mean? What else did you see that she didn't?" Margot smiled, and even in the moonlight, I could see her cheeks flushing slightly. "Your sense of humor, the way you remember little details about people, how you always tip service workers generously, even when you're on a tight budget. The way you listen, really listen, when someone is talking." Lyla said I was too serious. "You're thoughtful. There's a difference." She paused. "And the way you care about your family. Lyla always complained that you spent too much time with your parents and your sister. But I thought it was beautiful. You're loyal. You show up for people." Each observation felt like she was describing a version of myself I'd forgotten existed. With Lyla, I'd gradually become more reserved, more careful, constantly editing myself to fit what she seemed to want. "Can I tell you something that might sound crazy?" I said. "After tonight, I think we're beyond worrying about things sounding crazy. Talking to you like this, being here with you, it feels more natural than anything has felt in years. More natural than my relationship with Lyla ever felt." "It doesn't sound crazy," she said softly. "It feels natural to me too." I moved closer to her, and she didn't step away. In the moonlight, with my jacket wrapped around her shoulders and her hair loose around her face, she looked beautiful in a way that was completely different from Lyla's dramatic prettiness. Margot's beauty was quieter, more real, more her. "Margot," I said, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "Are you sure about this? Are you sure you want to get involved with someone whose life just exploded spectacularly in front of 60 people?" She laughed, and the sound echoed off the red rocks around us. "Julian, my life exploded too. I just declared my love for my best friend's fiancé at their rehearsal dinner. I'm pretty sure we're both going to be the subject of family gossip for years to come." "Good point. Besides," she said, stepping closer until there was barely any space between us, "I've been waiting 3 years for you to be available. I'm not going to let a little public scandal scare me off now." "A little public scandal? Margot, we basically destroyed a wedding in front of half of Arizona." "No," she said firmly, placing her hands on my chest. "Lyla and Nelson destroyed a wedding. We just saved you from making the biggest mistake of your life. And then, because holding back felt impossible after everything that had happened, I kissed her." It was soft and tentative at first, then deeper as she responded, her arms sliding up around my neck. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing harder, I rested my forehead against hers. "This feels like the first honest thing I've done in months," I said. Then let's keep being honest, she replied. About everything. As we stood there holding each other under the vast Arizona sky, I realized that the worst night of my life had somehow become the beginning of the best thing that had ever happened to me. I woke up the next morning in my hotel room to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. What should have been my wedding day had instead become a day of damage control, difficult conversations, and figuring out how to move forward from the wreckage of last night's revelations. But the first text I read wasn't from family or friends asking for explanations. It was from Margot, sent at 6:47 a.m. Good morning. I know today is going to be hard. I'm here if you need anything. Coffee? A friend? Someone to help you face the music? M. I found myself smiling for the first time since waking up. Even in the aftermath of our shared disaster, she was thinking about what I might need. I texted back, "Coffee sounds perfect. Meet me in the lobby in an hour?" Her response came immediately. "I'll bring the good stuff. The hotel coffee isn't going to cut it for a day like today." An hour later, I found her waiting in the lobby with 2 large cups from a local coffee shop and a paper bag that smelled like heaven. "Breakfast burritos," she explained, holding up the bag. "And your coffee is a double shot of their strongest blend." I figured we'd need the caffeine for all the conversations we're going to have today. She'd changed out of her formal dinner attire and was wearing jeans, a soft gray sweater, and sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup. She looked relaxed and beautiful and completely herself, a stark contrast to the carefully styled version of herself she'd maintained throughout the wedding weekend. "You know me too well," I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I should," she replied with a small smile. "I've been paying attention." We found a quiet corner of the lobby and settled into oversized armchairs, spreading the breakfast between us. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Sedona was waking up. Joggers on the trails, tourists heading out for Red Rock tours, the normal world continuing despite the fact that my entire life had changed overnight. "So," Margot said, taking a sip of her coffee. "How bad is it?" I pulled out my phone and scrolled through some of the messages. "My mother wants to know if we need to cancel the catering. My father wants to know if he should drive to Nelson's hotel and have a conversation with him. My sister thinks this is the best thing that's ever happened to me and wants to plan a celebration dinner. Smart woman, your sister." Lila's mother left a voicemail that was mostly crying. Lyla texted at 3 a.m. asking if we can work this out like adults. And Nelson. I paused, staring at his message. "Nelson wants to talk." "Are you going to?" "I don't know. Part of me thinks I should hear him out, get some closure. But honestly, I'm not sure I care enough to have that conversation." Margot studied my face carefully. "How are you feeling about all of this? Really?" I thought about it, taking a bite of the breakfast burrito while I considered her question. "You know what's weird? I should be devastated. My fiancé left me for my best friend. My wedding is canceled. My life plan is completely destroyed. But I feel more like myself than I have in years," I said, and realized as I said it that it was completely true. Yesterday morning, I was nervous about the wedding, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I kept telling myself it was normal pre-wedding jitters. But now I think it was because some part of me knew this wasn't right. What wasn't right about it? "Everything," I said, surprised by my own certainty. The way Lyla and I communicated, or didn't communicate. The way she seemed to tolerate my career instead of supporting it. The way I felt like I was constantly trying to be what she wanted instead of just being myself. Margot nodded, encouraging me to continue. "With you, even just sitting here having breakfast, I feel like I can say exactly what I'm thinking without worrying about how you'll react or whether it's what you want to hear. That's because I like who you actually are," she said simply. "I don't need you to be different." The honesty in her voice made my chest tighten with emotion. "How long have you felt that way?" "Since the beginning," she said. "Julian, can I tell you something that might sound presumptuous?" "After last night, I think we're past worrying about presumptuous," she smiled. "I've watched you in relationships before, Lyla. I saw you with Jessica in college and with Amanda after graduation, and you were always dimmed somehow. Like you were turning down the volume on yourself to fit what they wanted." I stared at her, struck by the accuracy of her observation. "You've been watching me that long?" "Not watching like a stalker," she said quickly, laughing. "But yes, I've been aware of you for longer than you might think. We had that contemporary literature class together senior year, remember?" I did remember, vaguely. It had been a large, lecture hall, and I'd usually sat in the back while she'd been up front, always prepared, always engaged with the discussion. "You sat 3 rows behind me and 2 seats to the left," she said, and my coffee cup stopped halfway to my mouth. "You remember exactly where I sat?" "I remember because every Tuesday and Thursday for an entire semester, I looked forward to your comments during discussion. You had this way of analyzing characters' motivations that was so insightful, so empathetic. Professor Williams always lit up when you raised your hand. I had no memory of Margot even being in that class, but apparently she'd been not only present, but paying attention to me specifically." "That's incredibly flattering and slightly embarrassing," I said. "Why embarrassing?" "Because I don't remember noticing you at all, and apparently you were cataloging my seating preferences and literary opinions." "I wasn't cataloging," she protested, but she was blushing. "I was appreciating." "There's a difference. Tell me more," I said, genuinely curious now. "What else do you remember?" "The day you argued with Brad Morrison about whether Gatsby was sympathetic or pathetic. You said that Gatsby's tragedy wasn't his idealism, but his inability to see Daisy as she actually was instead of as he wanted her to be. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, and you thought that was insightful. I thought it was brilliant, and I thought you were brave for disagreeing with Brad, who was basically the alpha male of the English department. I had no idea you were even listening." "I was always listening when you talked," she said quietly, even before I understood why. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of us processing the implications of what she'd just revealed. She'd been aware of me, interested in me, for years before we'd officially met through Lyla. "Margot," I said finally, "can I ask you something that might be difficult to answer? Anything. If you've had feelings for me for this long, why did you become friends with Lyla? Why put yourself through that?" She was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the red rocks in the distance. "Because she was dating you," she said finally. "And being her friend was the only way I could be part of your life, even peripherally. I thought maybe if I got to know you both, I'd see what made you happy with her, and maybe I could let go of these feelings that didn't make sense. But you didn't let go." "No," she admitted. "If anything, spending time around you both made it worse. Because I could see how you were with her versus how you were when she wasn't around. And I knew that you were settling for something that wasn't making you truly happy." The conviction in her voice took my breath away. "You saw all that?" "Julian, for 3 years I watched you make yourself smaller to fit into a relationship that didn't deserve you. Do you have any idea how hard that was? And suddenly I did. I could imagine what it would be like to watch someone you cared about diminish themselves, to see them accept less than they deserved, to want to save them but have no way to do it." "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm sorry you had to watch that. And I'm sorry it took a public disaster for me to see what you saw all along." "Don't be sorry," she said, reaching across the space between our chairs to take my hand. "Be grateful. We both got free last night." As her fingers intertwined with mine, I realized she was absolutely right. Whatever pain and embarrassment and complications lay ahead, both of us were finally free to be honest about what we wanted, and what I wanted was sitting right next to me. We spent the rest of the morning dealing with the practical aftermath of the canceled wedding. Phone calls to vendors, awkward conversations with family members, and the surreal experience of dismantling a life plan that had been 3 years in the making. Through it all, Margot stayed by my side, handling logistics with quiet efficiency and providing moral support when conversations got difficult. By early afternoon, we'd managed to cancel most of the wedding-related services and notify the extended family and friends who hadn't witnessed last night's dramatic revelations. My parents had driven back to Phoenix that morning, taking my sister's family with them, but not before my mother had pulled me aside for what she called a necessary conversation. "Julian," she'd said, taking my hands in hers, "I want you to know that your father and I are proud of you for choosing honesty over convenience. Even though it was a public disaster? Especially because it was a public disaster, she'd replied firmly. It would have been easier to go through with the wedding and figure it out later. But that would have been the coward's way, and you're not a coward. Those words had stayed with me throughout the day, giving me strength I didn't know I needed. Now, as the sun began to set over Sedona, Margot and I found ourselves back at the lookout point where we'd shared our first kiss. We'd brought dinner from a local restaurant and were sitting on a blanket I'd grabbed from my hotel room, watching the red rocks glow in the golden hour light. "Can I ask you something?" I said, finishing my sandwich and leaning back on my elbows. "Of course. Yesterday, when you said you remembered me from college, from that literature class, there was something in your voice that made me think there was more to the story." Margot went very still, her water bottle halfway to her lips. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you remembered incredibly specific details. Not just that I was in your class, but exactly where I sat, exactly what I said during discussions. That level of attention suggests, I don't know, something more significant than just casual awareness." She set down her water bottle and was quiet for so long that I started to worry I'd pushed too hard. "Julian," she said finally, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago. But I was too scared. And then, too much time passed, and then you were with Lyla and it felt impossible." My stomach dropped. "What is it? Do you remember the spring of our senior year? You were dating Jessica Chen, the pre-med student with the perfect GPA and the 5-year plan?" I nodded. Jessica and I had dated for about 6 months before she'd gotten into Harvard Medical School and decided she needed to focus entirely on her studies. There was a party at the end of April, Kevin Sullivan's house, near campus. Jessica was out of town visiting medical schools, and you came alone. I had a vague memory of the party, but it was fuzzy. College parties had a tendency to blur together, especially ones from over 5 years ago. "I was there with my roommate Sarah," Margot continued, "but she ditched me early to go home with some guy from her chemistry class. I was sitting on the back porch, reading, trying to avoid the chaos inside." "You were reading at a party?" "It was The Great Gatsby," she said with a small smile. "I was rereading it for a paper I was writing about idealism and disillusionment in American literature. And suddenly, like a door opening in my mind, I remembered." "Oh my God," I whispered. "You remember." I did remember. Not clearly, not completely, but enough. A girl on the back porch, curled up in a chair with a book, looking completely out of place at the loud, chaotic party. I'd been wandering around feeling equally out of place, missing Jessica, but not wanting to be the clingy boyfriend who called her while she was busy with important things. "I came out to get some air," I said slowly, the memory becoming clearer. "And you were there, reading. I made some joke about finding the only intellectual at the party. You said, 'Thank God someone who reads actual literature. Mind if I hide out here for a while?'" The memory was rushing back now, surprisingly vivid. We talked for hours. 3 hours, Margot confirmed. About books, about photography, about what we wanted to do after graduation, about feeling like outsiders in our own social circles. You told me about wanting to move to New York and work in graphic design. You said you felt like Phoenix was too small for your dreams. And you told me about wanting to build a photography business that focused on capturing real moments instead of posed perfection. You said most wedding photographers miss the actual love story because they're too focused on making everything look pretty. I stared at her, remembering more and more. The conversation had felt significant at the time, like meeting a kindred spirit. We'd connected on a level that felt rare and precious. "Why didn't we?" I started, then trailed off. "Why didn't we?" "What? Exchange numbers? Make plans to see each other again?" "Yeah." Margot looked down at her hands. "Because Jessica called while we were talking, and you lit up when you heard her voice. You talked to her for 20 minutes, telling her about your day, about the photos you'd taken that afternoon, about how much you missed her." I closed my eyes, remembering. Jessica had called from Boston, excited about her interviews, wanting to share every detail with me. "When you hung up," Margot continued, "you looked at me and said, 'Sorry about that. My girlfriend is amazing. I'm crazy about her.' The words hit me like a physical blow. Oh, Margot, And I realized that the most meaningful conversation I'd ever had with someone was just a pleasant distraction for you while you waited to talk to the person you actually cared about. That wasn't... It was, she said gently. And that was okay. You were in love with Jessica. You should have been excited to hear from her. But sitting there, listening to you talk about how crazy you were about her, I realized that I was already crazy about you. I felt sick. How did we never talk about this? Because 2 weeks later, Jessica broke up with you to focus on medical school. And a month after that, you graduated and moved back to Phoenix. And I stayed in Tucson for another semester to finish my internship requirements. But when you moved back, I was still in Tucson. And by the time I graduated and moved to Phoenix myself, you were already dating Amanda. I ran my hands through my hair trying to process this. How long were you in Phoenix before we officially met through Lyla? 8 months. 8 months? And you never reached out? Julian, what was I supposed to say? Hi, remember me? We had one conversation at a party 5 years ago, and I've been thinking about you ever since. You were in a relationship. Again. But then how did you end up meeting Lyla? This was the question I'd been building up to. The one that I somehow knew would change everything. Margot took a deep breath. Because I introduced you to her. The world seemed to stop spinning. What? Lyla and I met at a professional networking event for young women in creative industries. She was working at that marketing firm, and I was freelancing in graphic design. We hit it off immediately. She was funny and confident and everything I wasn't. I stared at her, my mind reeling. She mentioned that she was looking to meet someone, tired of the dating scene, wanting to find a good guy who wasn't just interested in hookups. And I thought of you. You set us up. I told her about this photographer I'd met who was talented and thoughtful and kind. I showed her some of your work that I'd found online. She was interested, so I reached out to you. That coffee shop meeting, I said, the pieces clicking into place. When you introduced us, you said you thought we'd get along. I thought you would, she said, tears starting to flow. I thought you'd be perfect for each other. She was outgoing, where you were reserved, confident where you were self-conscious. I thought she'd bring out the best in you. But you were in love with me, which is exactly why I thought I should introduce you to someone who could make you happy, she said, her voice breaking. Someone who deserved you more than I did. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Margot, you introduced me to the woman I was going to marry because you thought she deserved me more than you did? I thought she'd be better for you than I would be. I thought she'd make you happier than I could. And then you had to watch us fall in love. And then I had to watch you fall in love, she confirmed. And be happy about it, because that's what friends do. I stood up abruptly, pacing to the edge of the lookout point, trying to process what she'd just told me. For 3 years, Margot had watched me build a relationship with a woman she'd introduced me to, believing that woman was better for me than she was. Do you have any idea? I said, turning back to face her. How extraordinary that is. How selfless and heartbreaking and incredible. It's not extraordinary, she said quietly. It's just what you do when you love someone. You want them to be happy, even if it's not with you. I walked back to where she was sitting and knelt down in front of her, taking her face in my hands. Margot Davies, I said, you have been taking care of me for 5 years without me even knowing it. You've been supporting my dreams, watching out for my happiness, and putting my needs before your own since before we even really knew each other. Julian, I'm not finished, I said. You introduced me to Lyla because you thought she'd make me happy. And when you realized she wasn't, you still stayed quiet because you thought that was what was best for me. Last night, you risked our friendship and your own happiness to save me from making the biggest mistake of my life. She was crying openly now. Do you know what that makes you? I asked. Pathetic? That makes you the love of my life. 1 year later. The morning light streaming through the windows of our shared studio apartment in downtown Phoenix felt different than any light I'd ever experienced. Maybe it was because for the first time in my adult life, I was waking up next to someone who truly saw me, loved me, and chose me every single day. Margot was already awake, sitting cross-legged in bed with her laptop working on a logo design for a new client. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight, and she was wearing one of my old photography workshop t-shirts that somehow looked better on her than it ever had on me. "Good morning, beautiful," I said, reaching over to kiss her shoulder. "Good morning," she replied, not looking up from her screen but smiling in that way that still made my chest tighten with love. "Your coffee's on the nightstand." And before you ask, yes, I remembered the extra shot. This was what happiness felt like. Not the anxious, walking on eggshells feeling I'd mistaken for love with Lyla, but this deep, settled contentment that came from being completely known and accepted. "How's the Johnson wedding portfolio coming along?" she asked, finally closing her laptop and curling up against my side. "Finished it last night. I think it's some of my best work." And it was. The photos from yesterday's ceremony captured something I'd never managed to capture before. Genuine joy, authentic love, the real moments between real people who actually chose each other. "I'm proud of you," Margot said simply, and I knew she meant it. She'd been there for every late-night editing session, every difficult client conversation, every moment of doubt when building my business felt impossible. She celebrated my successes, like they were her own, and supported me through failures without ever making me feel like less than enough. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister. "Lunch today? I want to hear about the Henderson wedding shoot." "Teresa wants to have lunch," I told Margot. "Want to come?" "Always," she said. "I love your sister." The feeling was mutual. My entire family had embraced Margot with an enthusiasm that sometimes embarrassed me. My mother called her at least twice a week. My father had asked for her graphic design advice on his business logo, and Teresa treated her like the sister she'd always wanted. As for Lyla and Nelson, they'd lasted exactly 4 months. Turns out that when your relationship is built on betrayal and the thrill of forbidden love, it doesn't survive the reality of grocery shopping and paying bills together. Lyla had reached out 6 months ago, wanting to reconnect as friends, but I'd politely declined. "Some chapters are meant to stay closed." "Julian," Margot said, her voice taking on that serious tone that meant she had something important to say. "What is it?" "I was thinking about something last night. About that party in college, when we first really talked." "What about it?" "I keep wondering what would have happened if Jessica hadn't called. If we'd exchanged numbers, if we'd stayed in touch." I considered this, running my fingers through her hair. "I think we would have found our way to each other eventually," I said. "Maybe it would have been sooner. Maybe it would have taken even longer. But I think we were always meant to end up here." "You really believe that?" "I believe that sometimes the best things come from the worst disasters. I believe that you saved me from settling for something that was never right. And I believe that loving you is the easiest, most natural thing I've ever done." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I have something to tell you." "Good something? Or concerning something?" "Good something." She smiled, reaching into her nightstand drawer and pulling out a small velvet box. "Julian Turner, you're not the only one who can plan surprises." I stared at the box, then at her face, my heart hammering. "Margot Davies," I said, "are you proposing to me?" "Someone has to," she said with that laugh I'd fallen in love with 5 years ago. "And I've been waiting long enough." As I opened the box to find a simple, elegant ring, exactly what I would have chosen, I realized that this was what a real love story looked like. Not dramatic declarations and public scenes, but quiet mornings and shared coffee, and someone who knows you well, enough to choose the perfect ring. "Yes," I said, pulling her close. "Obviously, yes." And as we kissed in the morning light, I thought about how sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find everything you actually needed. Sometimes the person who's meant for you has been there all along, quietly loving you, waiting for you to be ready to love them back. Sometimes the best plot twist is realizing that your love story started long before you knew you were living in one. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. so you don't miss any upload from us.